Let's talk.
John Brown.
Fast tracks and dark deals, how sport became business and business became sport. It's the autobiography of one of the last standing insiders, and it looks at the business of sport and its evolution over the past 50 years. It is by Michael Payne. I'm delighted to say that Michael joins me live on the line, either trackside next to a tennis court at the MCC or somewhere like that. Michael, good morning to you, sir.
Great to be with you all.
Good to have you indeed. For those who don't know, just a little bit of your background and how you got into the business.
Well, I was actually originally a ski racer, and I wasn't very good at winning any of the competitions. So I changed to hot dogging or acrobatic skiing, and that was on the pro circuit back in the 70s. But in order to survive, I had to go and find sponsors to pay for my hotel and air tickets. And bottom line, I was a lot better at finding sponsors than I was at winning any of the competitions. So I decided to change, and I moved into what was the very beginning of the sports marketing industry. Because
back in the day, presumably you just wanted somebody who could pay for your hotel room and your equipment. There wasn't a YouTube, and forgive me if I missed it on one of the 3 or 4 TV channels in the UK. It wasn't sort of featured on the main terrestrial channels because that's all we had in those days. So presumably this was a very, very sort of low key sponsorship.
It was the beginning of an industry, which, I mean, you go back and you look at the billion-dollar deals that are in play today. It's all a far cry. I mean, in the early 70s, I mean, to give an example, one of the world's most famous athletes, Arnold Palmer, struck an endorsement deal for the grand sum of $500 and all the ketchup he could eat. And, here you had these rock star athletes who were earning nothing. And it was the beginning of an industry. I mean, the agent, Mark McCormack, who came along and said, maybe these athletes should be treated like Hollywood stars. And so whether it's the evolution of the athletes, the evolution of the events, it's the story of over the last 50 years of how sport, became a business and frankly survived.
Because before that, it's the old Corinthian idea, isn't it? You should just be happy for putting on a jersey and representing your country or having the opportunity to do that sort of thing. So how could you possibly want money for it?
Well, it's true, but also, I mean, who could watch it? Because television was still also in the early days. It's interesting. We're a couple of months away from the Winter Olympic Games in Milano Cortina, and the last time they were staged in Cortina, 1956, was the very first time that the Winter Games were televised. And they didn't exactly get off to a great start because in the middle of the opening ceremony, as the last torchbearer was skating around the ice, he didn't realize the TV cables had been stretched out over the ice. And so he tripped over the cables, proceeded to drop the sacred Olympic torch. The Olympic flame went out. It had to be relit by a spectator. So, I mean, the early days of television were a roller coaster, an interesting experience when you compare to how it stands today. And it's been a remarkable evolution of the industry, where now a fan can watch any event, any athlete from around the world. The innovation and technology of broadcasting, you're sitting in your living room and you might as well be in the stadium in terms of the whole experience. So it's been a fascinating journey. And then at the end of the book, I asked the question, well, what's going to happen over the next 50 years?
Because the interesting thing is, during that period when we have satellite TV comes in terms of, I'm thinking 1970 World Cup, which is the one in colour, and suddenly everybody can watch the World Cup, international football, just a couple of matches on their TVs in colour, and that changes the whole way that people look at sport. It suddenly becomes, so the global game really does become a global game, and that opens up sponsorship opportunities for companies who kind of get that. And no finer proponent than that is than Bernie Ecclestone, who took what was basically a very small. I mean, my father was a racing driver in the late 60s, early 70s. He took a very small boys' club of people doing extremely dangerous things, and Bernie sells, gets the rights and sells it as a global event, and racing cars basically become, if you like, sort of fast-moving advertising hoardings, much to the dismay of many of the old boys. But actually, it means that the sport actually survives and thrives.
Well, absolutely. I mean, after I left the IOC, I spent 15 years as Bernie's right hand. And it was the most remarkable adventure and learning. I think he is probably the greatest commercial negotiator I've ever met. He's still going strong. He is 95 and called me yesterday from Tashkent in Uzbekistan. And I said to Bernie, "What are you doing there?" "Oh, Michael, there's a deal to be done," and everything else. There he is, 95, in Tashkent, and we're talking about sort of sporting potential and opportunities there. The book goes back and looks at some of the visionaries who really created the industry. And Bernie was absolutely one of those. Another was Mark McCormack, the super athlete agent. Another was Horst Dassler, who was the son of the founder of Adidas, it was interesting. He was sort of supplying his soccer balls to FIFA. And you go back to the World Cup, you sort of mentioned it in the 70s. FIFA had a total staff of 4 employees. That is how the whole industry has evolved. And Dassler was the first one to realize he wouldn't be able to keep paying these federations to use his footballs. He needed to find somebody else to, carry some of the freight, and turned to Coca-Cola and said, "Don't you think football could be an interesting platform for you to market soft drinks?" And this is how the whole sponsorship industry, came about. And, I was very fortunate to get in at the very ground floor. And like with any industry, it's fascinating to see how it evolves. And, you look back and you think, how is this possible? How could it be so, it's a cottage industry? And yet you're dealing with something of sport that, everybody is so passionate about around the world. So it was a great journey.
Yeah, and of course, the other thing is people say, "Oh, well, sponsorship is ruining the sport, this, that, or the other, and it's far too expensive at a grassroots level." But if you take away the monetary worries that these athletes have, I'm thinking tennis and golf as well. I mean, they have been able to hone their games to levels that they would have been unable to do before. I played very bad rugby in the early 90s and saw when the game went semi-professional, the amateurism debate, and you could tell the athletes who were being paid by their governments, and so suddenly the sport progresses, it develops, and it becomes much more of a product and a package, and that can be no bad thing, Michael.
Well, you're right, but there's no question there is a great commercial debate about, has sport been over-commercialized, and has commercialization corrupted the Corinthian ideal? There are cases where, the commercial agenda has perhaps gone too far, and it's a balancing act to make sure that, sport survives. Because let's be clear, at the Olympics, when I joined the IOC, the Olympics were bankrupt. People forget, in the late 70s, early 80s, you couldn't give the games away. There was no money in the bank, and there was no queue of people, no governments wanting to fund them. So either you had to roll up your sleeves and find and develop a business strategy, or it was game over. And that could be repeated, time and again across every sport. Yes, it's very nice to have the sort of ancient tradition and to go back to the venue, but shouldn't the experience be shared worldwide? You referenced tennis there, how a great tennis star becomes a catalyst and motivation for building tennis in the country. And you open up new sports, you open up new countries. And I think the more that can be done there to promote sport and, address the overall health crisis that humanity is facing, the better. And sport, I mean, whether you're playing or watching, it provides great entertainment. I suppose the challenge for the leaders of these governing bodies, whether it's Infantino at FIFA, Coventry at the Olympics, is to make sure you find the right balance, that the commercial agenda is there to serve sport, not sport serving the commercial agenda.
I suppose one of the great things about sport is it's the unpredictability. There is a drama in sport. You know, the small team gets the last minute goal. You know, the wheel falls off the car, or the number one tennis player gets knocked out by a wild card. You can't predict that, and that is why it is so. You don't need language skills. You just watch sport, and so therefore it is a global phenomenon that people want to get involved with the inbuilt drama as well, and that has, from a commercial aspect, is perhaps what makes it unique, rather than sponsoring a band tour or just putting, I was going to say, an advert in a magazine. That just dates me, but you see where I'm coming from.
Well, yeah, I mean, sport, it cuts through the clutter. Because, you know, if the World Cup is taking place or the Olympics, all Formula One, everybody's going to be tuning in. And in this day where, you know, you are bombarded with messages, you don't know which way to turn, you know, it's not easy for a marketeer as to how do they promote their product. If you're tied to sport, you are tied to something that people are passionate about. You're tied to something that you know people are going to watch. But to your point about the unpredictability, I mean, that's key to sports DNA, and why the risk of match fixing, you know, is perhaps the biggest single threat to sport. Because if you remove unpredictability and the score is fixed, people are going to turn off. You know, it's just another soap opera. And, you know, there's a big debate about the risk between, say, doping in sport and match fixing. I mean, protecting the athlete is critical, and doping in sport is a big threat. But I think match fixing is a far bigger threat, because people really care about the result. And if they feel that it's been fixed, they'll move on.
How big a blow? How worried were you when tobacco sponsorship came out? Were you actually in the business when those bans started coming in? Because at that point we thought, okay, if the cigarette companies, the Philip Morris can't get involved, sport's going to take a nosedive, because they're the only people who can afford to pump that money in. Was that a worry, Michael?
I mean, short answer, yes. I mean, tobacco sponsorship, when they turned to sport as their advertising platform because they could no longer advertise directly on television, they were pumping so much money into particularly Formula One. And, you know, there's a fairly high-profile story that in order to delay the legislation in Britain against tobacco sponsorship, there was a rather famous donation to Tony Blair from Bernie Ecclestone of $1 million, which unconnected, wasn't linked to the legislation, but became legend, and in Cockney slang, $1 million is now called a Bernie. But it was the sports world needed to wean itself off the tobacco hook. And if you look today, you've got governments paying ever more attention to different sectors, different industries. In a number of countries like France, alcohol sponsorship is banned. And then you've got the whole environmental movement saying, no, you can't have car sponsors or oil companies because it's bad for the environment. So if you're not careful, there are not going to be many industries or categories left supporting sport. And if government wants to legislate, fine, but then they're going to have to put their own hand in their pocket, to replace what the commercial world is providing. And I'm not sure they're willing to do that.
And then, of course, we had the internet and TV stations, rather than being sort of the big three or the big four in the UK. Now, the way that people watch their sport, take their information, has changed completely. And so, there are Red Bull channels. There are various, everything seems to have a following now, in terms if you go online, you will find everything from Formula One to, I don't know, toad racing in the Andes. There'll be somebody covering it online.
Which is streaming, and it's giving the fan the choice. I may not like toad racing, but as you say, somebody in South America will, and that explosion of content is it's a great opportunity. And I think if you look down the road, it's possible that the athlete himself could become the single most important broadcaster. Because you take a top athlete who has hundreds of millions of followers on his Instagram, even 1 billion, and they're able to talk about their life, how they train, their family, their dogs. That content that is happening off the field of play, particularly to the younger generations, is as valuable and interesting as the content on the field of play. And so the athlete is going to become only more important, earn more money, and become his own individual broadcaster. That's got you thinking.
Yes, it has indeed. Absolutely, because obviously you're preaching to the converted. You've got your followers. You know your market. That is a marketing man's dream, because there it is. There's the data. There is your captive audience straight off the bat. Where do you think we're going with this, Michael? What do you think the industry? I mean, can we look into the future, or is the industry now so unpredictable? We don't know what's coming up next. Will it be 3D? Will it be virtual reality? I mean, where do you think? Do you think the?
Well, yeah. It would be very dangerous for somebody in any industry to say that we've arrived. And that's probably the moment you take that mindset is probably the moment you start to slowly die. So you have to keep pushing. You have to keep exploring. I mean, one of the forecasts that I make in the book is to say that within the next 50 years, frankly, probably within the next 10 to 15 years, the World Cup final will be staged in 5 stadiums on 5 continents, live at the same time. 1 stadium will have humans. 4 stadiums will have live avatars, not with goggles or glasses, but you will be sitting in the stadium and you will have the identical experience to the one you're sitting in the stadium with the humans. And if you think that's far-fetched, go to London and see the ABBA concert where they have ABBA on stage with avatars. And I guarantee within 5 seconds, you are taken back in time as if it was a real live ABBA concert. So, technology is already beginning to provide that today. No question. Within 10 or 15 years, you will have that experience. And that will mean that people can share all around the world a unique experience. My younger son is a passionate football fan. He would far rather go to the local pub and have a community and be with 50 or 100 people celebrating the goal than sitting at home, even if it's with a couple of mates. So the technology is going to dramatically enhance, the experience. I mean, think of what's sitting in your own home, how the broadcast of the size of the screens, the quality of the audio has completely changed from being, somewhat passive, sitting back on the sofa, to getting you onto the edge of your seat.
How much fun was it to write this book? Looking back. I mean,
a lot of fun, because I've led the most fortunate life of working in a field that most people would say I'd be happy to pay to have that job. There are elements of the book that are referred to as a spy thriller, because we deal with the KGB, the Mossad, the CIA. I mean, the KGB very kindly broke into my office in Switzerland to steal my hard drive during one particular negotiation. And a year later, I found myself in Russia, in Sochi, skiing behind a gentleman who was wearing handcuffs attached to a suitcase. And you realize that, of course, he was carrying the nuclear codes and was skiing just behind the president of Russia, Dmitry Medvedev at the time. And I was part of a very small group of about a dozen people with him. And when we got to the bottom of the ski run, I turned around to the assistant and said, all right, guys, now you've won. Could I have my hard drive back? So that's why, the book at times is called Dark Deals. And there were many colorful adventures, whether it was in the early days where Samaranch effectively double-crossing North Korea in order to ensure that the Chinese and the Soviets would come to the Olympic Games in 1988 and break the boycott. Some of the stories with Bernie negotiating with Putin, I mean, they are just amazing adventures of what's going on behind the scenes.
Fascinating stuff. And presumably you got to sit in the Kremlin. Wasn't that what Bernie called his huge motorhome? The 3 motorhomes that he used to
I got to sit in the Kremlin in the Formula One races, his blacked out bus that was his center of control. I got to sit in the Kremlin in Moscow, with Yeltsin in negotiations. And, I joined the IOC in the middle of the Cold War, when there were the superpower boycotts between the Soviets and the US. And, along that whole journey, the wall coming down, still doing business dealings with, still at the Soviets, then the Russians, and the whole transformation of the sports industry, in the Soviet. I first went to China in 1989, and driving from the airport to downtown Beijing was a dirt road. And to see the transformation over the following 30 years, today I am still advising Alibaba and the whole role of AI in sport. And so it's this transformation, whether it's industry, whether it's been watching countries, it's been an incredible journey, and have tried to tell a few of the stories.
What do you hope that people will learn from Fast Tracks and Dark Deals?
I mean, first of all, I hope that first and foremost that they find it a fun read. It's not short, as you can see. It's some sort of 650 pages with a few interesting photographs documenting the history of the sport. But one that is fun. Two, I never knew that. The idea that obviously they've seen the Olympic Games, they watch Formula One, but nobody necessarily wonders, well, how does it all come together? What are the politics that it takes to get 205 countries to turn up at the same time in the same place? No, the UN can't achieve that. So how the hell does the IOC achieve it? And, it's not as simple as just sending out an invitation and all please turn up. And, one of the biggest challenges I talk of the future is the growing weaponization of the politics of sport. And you only have to look at, the US, the situation with Donald Trump at the moment, the controversy last week over whether FIFA should have awarded him a peace prize or not. Frankly, I think Infantino is doing the right thing in terms of cozying up to Trump, because he needs Washington's support. He needs Trump's support to stage a great World Cup. And I think Trump will be fully behind staging a great World Cup and staging a great Olympics. His foreign policy may create a few sleepless nights for leaders in trying to make sure that everybody does turn up. And so, what's going on in the kitchen, the back of house? I think anybody who is interested in sport will be interested in, well, how does all that happen? there are also a lot of, I think, quite interesting insights on the world of business. When you're going into a room with all the different cultures, how do you read the room? How do you actually take a complex deal forward with China or with Australia? It is totally different with each culture, each environment. And so, again, sharing some of the experiences, some of the insights, some of the mistakes, because you learn from your mistakes. I think, as I said in the end, I just hope people will find it a romping read. And yeah, I never knew that's how it all came together or worked.
We've got 20 seconds. Michael, where can people find you online if they want to say hello?
They can find me on social media. It's Michael R. Payne 1. The book's available on Amazon.
And they can order it via our own virtual bookstore. Michael, I could talk to you until next Monday about this, but we're about to crash the news. Michael Payne, it's been an absolute pleasure to speak to you today.
Great to be with you.